I'll be speaking to Donald Wagner. He is an ordained Presbyterian minister, active with the Presbyterian Justice Network, former director of Sabil's North America group. He has written 6 books, including Glory to God in the Lowest, Journeys to an Unholy Land, which came out, I believe, in 2022. We spoke last time about his opposition to Christian Zionism. This time, we want to talk about some of his experiences in Lebanon, particularly in 1982. That year is special for many of us. It woke us up to the terrible brutality of Israeli governments. That government's role in the Sabra Shatila massacre in Beirut seared that into many of our consciousnesses. Good morning, Donald Wagner.
Good morning, Stan.
We're recording on September 11th, just days before the anniversary of the terrible Sabra and Shatila massacres of mid-September in 1982. You were an eyewitness to its aftermath. Could you describe what you saw?
Right. I was with a group of 3, and we arrived in Beirut the day after the massacre, early in the morning, and we went down to our host, Gabi Habib, who was the head of the Middle East Council of Churches, and he was convening a meeting with about 25 physicians and nurses, many of whom were eyewitnesses to the massacre as they were serving in Palestinian hospitals adjacent to or in Sabra Shatila. And Gabi said, you need to get right over to the site of the massacre. So we walked in and we entered right at the point where the Israeli command center, a 6-story tower where they could see everything. So we saw that, and immediately we were handed a handkerchief doused with cologne by Red Crescent or Red Cross workers. They said, you have to hold this over your mouth, your nose, because the stench of death will make you sick. As we walked closer, some of the families were just coming back for the first time, and the workers were pulling bodies or pieces of bodies out. It was about 95 degrees and humid, so the bodies had decomposed, and it was just a surreal sense of death everywhere. And I was able to find a person who spoke English. He was a shopkeeper. His English was pretty good. And he told me that he had been out of the camp for a couple of days buying supplies for his little shop. And he tried to get back in that Friday, and the Israelis had sealed off all the entrances. So he stayed with a cousin who had a balcony that overlooked Sabra Shatila. So he saw everything.
Hmm.
And he saw the Israelis initially, he said, fire several rounds of ammunition into the camps, and then the Lebanese militias were allowed in. And he said you could hear the noise, attacks, and the Israelis then put up flares so the massacre could go on into the night. And he said, I couldn't imagine, what would happen to my daughters, my son, and my wife. And sure enough, one son escaped, but everyone else was killed. He lost everything. And he described how they also bulldozed. After they did the slaughter, they brought in bulldozers and leveled the place. And it was just, it's the worst thing I ever experienced in my life. I did 2 or 3 more interviews.
You
Sorry?
saw you saw the bulldozers?
No, I just saw the aftermath of it.
I
You know,
see.
'cause everything was leveled. There was hardly a building standing. And these are the little brick tiny hovels or shops where the Palestinians lived. And I interviewed a few, two or three others, and one was a young fellow who escaped. He got out the back as before the militias came, and he somehow made his way to a mosque and survived. Um, I remember sitting. I couldn't take too much anymore, and I imagine here am I. I won't have to live. I didn't lose anybody. But the grief and the terror was just so overwhelming. And I sat on a mound of hill, and it turned out I was sitting next to three or four French journalists, and we watched kind of a parade of body bags being carried and deposited into a mass burial site. And I remember speaking to the woman beside me, and she spoke good English, and she was crying. And I said, I'm sorry. She said, I've been here for 3 weeks covering the end of the invasion and the evacuation of the PLO. And now this, how much more can these people take? And I said, how many do you think are in this mass grave? She said, I was counting and I lost track. But look, turn to your right. They were digging another mass grave. And who knows how many. And then I saw a Muslim sheikh, walk by, and I excused myself. I ran and caught up with him. And I apologized. And I said, my heart goes out to all of you. Are you the imam of the mosque nearby? I'd seen that mosque. And he said, yeah, I am. And he said, can you imagine that many of these people were with me at Friday prayers before all this happened?
Mm.
Um, and I said, how many do you think the Israelis or the militias have killed here? And he said, we'll never know, because I remember looking out from my mosque on Friday afternoon or Friday evening, and I saw them line up people, men, machine gun them to death, and then load their bodies onto trucks. And he said they did this over and over. We'll never know where these bodies are. And his estimate was, I think, 2,000 to 3,000, but it was a total guess.
Right.
So that, yeah, that. So I was not in there when it happened, but I saw the aftermath. I saw, the broken-hearted families coming back, women screaming as body parts of their children were pulled out. Why, oh Allah, oh why? Uh, this is our destiny as Palestinians. Uh, so it was just a very grim, surreal, ugly thing. And I was struck that this is a sign of the continuing Nakba. This qualified as a genocide, at least as a war crime, but
Right.
there was intent, mass murder, et cetera, and then the attempt to cover up. And of course, the largest demonstrations in the Middle East were in Tel Aviv. Um, and but the
Later on.
sorry,
Later on.
yeah,
When,
yeah, yeah. But within days,
mhm.
uh, there were demonstrations across the Arab world, but Tel Aviv had the strongest, so there's a strong opposition. But then the Kahan Commission really was a whitewash. Sharon, who you know planned it. We learned later that he and Raphael Itan, one of the military commanders, met with the Lebanese militias, and we we remember that the sequence was that Bashir Gemayel was blown up and assassinated in his compound that week. I believe it was on a Wednesday. Sharon and Eitan flew up from Israel, met with the Phalangist militia, and blamed the Palestinians for it. And that set the background. That was the motivation. It was a revenge. Of course, there was bad blood with the Phalangists and the PLO. But
Let's
we
go
were,
further. Let's go further into the background of all this, starting with yourself. When did you first start going to Lebanon?
I believe it was when I first got involved in 1978. I went alone in September of that year, and I was very naive and new to the issues, and I was just getting involved with Middle East issues and concerns. And I was hosted by the Middle East Council of Churches, and they took me all over. I remember one of the first mornings, I went to uh, a restricted area. We snuck behind the Lebanese army, and there was a massive area, and it was the burial ground of the Tel Zatar massacre. I was with a radical Coptic priest um, who was very sympathetic with the Palestinians, and he took me across that, and he said, "You're walking over what once was a city, of maybe 30,000." And there's a 52-day war between that refugee camp and the Phalangists, and then Syria came in with the Phalangists and finished off and massacred. There was another massacre. Some got away and
Massacred the Palestinians.
massacred the Palestinians. It was Palestinians and poor Lebanese.
And
Yeah,
we should clarify Phalange. I believe it translates, or they were often called Lebanese forces. But we're
yeah,
not talking about the Lebanese army, as you say. It's a private.
right. It was a private militia made up of Maronite Christians, and which is a Christian sect. Um, and they had kind of this ethnos nationalism. I remember going up and meeting with seminary professors, Maronite seminary professors, who also served in the militia, interestingly.
Mm.
And it was my first time to get the background. So I asked about their history and their relationship to the others. And they were in a very upper class area in Junia, about 20 miles north of Lebanon, high, very European. And they said, you have to realize we are not Arabs. We are Phoenicians.
Hmm.
So they were reclaiming that, ethnocentric nationalism. And,
But they were
uh,
speaking Arabic.
and oh, yeah, they spoke Arabic, but also French. They were good in English,
Okay.
but they're very European. And it turns out France has always favored them since the Crusades,
Mm.
as they were a branch of Catholicism. So this has a long history going back. But Israel latched on to the Phalangist movement and the Maronites, and they were training and outfitting the militia that was led by Bashir Gemayel, the son of the founder of his father. Pierre Gemayel was the founder of the Phalangist movement in the 30s, and it was modeled after, well, in some ways, the Nazis, but also the Spanish fascists.
Hmm.
So that's the background of this group. Um, yeah,
So that was in the
interesting.
70s. So that's in the
This
70s.
was in the 70s. Yeah.
And then you went in 82.
So
So
again, I went in 82. In the summer, in January 82, I took a large group of about 35, 36 people. And in one of our meetings, we uh, we met with Amin Gemayel, who was the other brother of Pierre Gemayel, uh,
You
and
mean
our
the son of Pierre
the
Jamal.
son, yeah, the son,
Right.
brother of Bashir,
Right.
and our host Gabi Habib called me at midnight after I got back to the hotel after that meeting and said, "Don, I just had a call from Bashir Gemayel because your visit was covered on Lebanese television. And Bashir said, if you don't arrange a meeting with these people, I'm going to kill you." And he said, with Bashir, you took that seriously because he had already killed a few other opposition leaders. We don't know if it was a joke or not. So the next morning, I took half the group and met with Bashir to meet that. So he was satisfied that he had a meeting with us. So
What was that
yes,
like? What do you recall about him?
he was a strong man. He didn't know. He didn't want to talk about. He did mention their long history with the PLO, which was very adversarial. They had been through a lot of fighting, and by now, the Civil War was on. So the PLO was in the opposition, along with Druze, some progressive Muslim groups, and so on. And the Civil War was well underway by this meeting, and he basically said, we will defend ourselves. We are a minority, and we have always survived. And we asked about the arrangements with Israel, their alignment, and he admitted it, but he didn't go into detail. So that was it was a very interesting time.
So let's see if this is right. So there was a large Palestinian presence, hundreds of thousands of people who had been thrown out of Palestine, Israel, 1948, and so on.
Right,
And then there was an armed force. The PLO had armed forces there, and Israel wanted to expel them. And this is the start of 82, and there was constant threats of warfare. So could
right.
you pick it up from that point?
Yeah. Also, I remember the Palestinians were thrown out of Jordan after Black September,
Mhm.
and so you had Palestinians who were refugees from mostly the Galilee region of Palestine, but also a large number from Jordan, and I think there were 7 or 8 refugee camps. Very, very poor, but the PLO had kind of regrouped. It really was a mini state within a state. And of course, they had their armies, their militia, their different factions. Um, but they also did a lot, for the poor, because the Lebanese did not allow Palestinians to get jobs in the normal way. So you either had small shops, or you're a taxi driver, or menial jobs. So it was a very, very poor population, but certainly, it was almost like a mini state within Lebanon. And Israel was hell bent on uprooting that. And that's the background to June '82. When we went there, there were threats of war. Uh, that at any point you expected an Israeli invasion, an Israeli attack in January. But there was also a truce. There had been fighting in July 81. I also went over with a group and saw the aftermath of that. And there was a treaty between the PLO that was brokered, I think, by the Saudis. And it was a non-aggression treaty. And it was monitored by the United Nations, and they claimed that the PLO abided by that, and there were no rockets sent into Israel. Um, they also said there were well over 1,000 Israeli attempts to provoke something by sea, by air, and by land. And UNIFIL, which is the United Nations force in South Lebanon, monitored all that. So when we were there in June, um, it was exactly June the 4th. I remember we're up in Junia meeting with the phalangists, and we were driving back to Beirut, and there was the traffic was unbelievable of people flooding out of Beirut. So we wondered what was going on. So they turned on the radio, and there was an attempt, an anti-PLO group, anti-Abu Nadal group, uh, which was an they had tried to assassinate Arafat 7 times. So they attempted to kill the Israeli ambassador of London by the name of Argoff. He survived it. But since Israel had no other pretext, that was the pretext for the Israeli invasion. So on June the 4th, we were on our way to meet with the PLO, and we had to stop because a couple guys couldn't hold it, had to go to the bathroom really bad. We stopped at our hotel at 3 o'clock. I remember exactly. I was upset because we were going to be late for our appointment. And the guys got out of the bus, ran into the hotel, and the bomb started. And they hit the Fakani area where we were supposed to be. So we all got in, and that was the beginning of the invasion of Lebanon.
And you
And
saw
it was,
some pretty dramatic things, casualties right on June 4th.
yeah, so June 4th, that was the real beginning. It wasn't the 6th. And there were several hundred casualties. I remember from our hotel, there was a lull after the initial bombing in Fakani, and we went up to the top floor, and we had binoculars so we could see. And sure enough, the ambulances and relief workers were coming into the city sportive, which is the big stadium where a lot of refugees lived. And we saw the ambulances come in, and the F-16s came in from the sea, and they bombed and hit the ambulances and the relief workers. And we were just appalled at that. So yeah, so that we had a ringside seat to the invasion right there.
I think you, in your book, you mentioned a bus of children. Did I
Oh,
get that right?
the next morning, which was a Saturday morning, we were scheduled to tour one of the Red Crescent hospitals. But it was the one right adjacent to Sabra Shatila. And we arrived, and we were having this little tour, and then the sirens went off, and they had to evacuate all the patients to the basement because they didn't know if there'd be another bombing. The hospital had been hit the day before. A wing had been hit. Nobody was killed, but the hospital was hit. And of course, we see that pattern with Gaza now. And we were in the basement, and all of a sudden, ambulances began to roll in, and they were unloading schoolgirls, Palestinians from the camps were out on a field trip in UN marked buses. And we were speaking to a nurse. She said, I used to coordinate that. The Israelis had all the they had the whole path of the excursion. This was all prearranged. They knew these girls were schoolgirls in a UN marked bus, and they hit 3 buses. They bombed them. And 19 girls came in body bags dead.
Mm.
And then we saw people burn, young girls burn with arms missing. And it was just appalling. And the families were arriving and screaming, at learning the fate of one of their daughters. And, that was another really deafening thing.
So you saw the casualties, the body bags, and you mentioned in the book girls missing limbs.
Yes. Yeah, we saw that. And, the families were just screaming. And, um, it just, we broke down. We were all crying, witnessing that scene. It just gives me chills even thinking through it again. And after that, we I told one of my co-leaders, let's see if we can get some coverage and do an interview with the Western media. So we tracked down ABC, CBS, NBC, and CNN. The only one that we found, I remember his name, Mike Mallory, who's a bureau chief at CBS. And we said, hey, we just came and we experienced the bombing yesterday. We just saw this happen where schoolgirls were killed. Could you do an interview about it? And he said, well, yeah, maybe because you're Americans, we can get some coverage. He said, everything we've been sending up has been cut on the floor and is not being aired by NBC. And he said it's all being censored by the Israeli military. So we
Yeah.
did our interview, and then told them exactly what we saw in the day before with the bombings, and then in the hospital, and with the schoolgirls, 19 dead, and I don't know how many were injured and savagely burned. Um, and we learned later it never aired.
Oh.
So there was that censorship. And I remember coming back uh, and doing a few interviews, and we were so far ahead of the curve. And I remember once I got back, I turned on TV, and you could see anything coming from Beirut had it was identified with a kind of a logo at the bottom of the screen, censored by the Israeli Defense Forces.
Mm. Mm.
So they were in the studio censoring the coverage, and it took a good month or more before you began to have more accurate coverage of the thing.
And here in Gaza now, they don't even let the international media into Gaza, so we only get their point of view. But of course, the citizen journalists from Gaza are figuring ways to get the word out.
Yeah, yeah. But the whole that the invasion of Lebanon, the Sabra Shatila massacre, that was a foretaste of what was to come. It was a warning. I don't think I realized at the time this is genocide, and we didn't call it that, but it was. And I remember doing an interview. I mentioned this in the book. I had an interview with an Israeli general. My staff arranged it with NBC Chicago, and the general would not allow me to be in the studio. And I remember before the interview, I said, who's in charge of the interview? Is NBC or is who arranged this? And eventually he said, oh, the Israeli consulate arranged it. And that was a stipulation. So I had to be interviewed in Grant Park on the street, and he was in the studio. So he went first and talked about his whole that this was a defensive war, that the PLO had attacked first, and that was not true. And they were precise bombing, precision bombing. No civilians were being killed. So I went on and told my side of it. Well, you hit a hospital. As we saw the results with these schoolgirls, they were completely innocent. 3 buses were bombed. We don't think by accident. A number of civilians. We saw the sports city with refugees being hit. So he got very aggressive, and then he made the statement, this is our final solution to the Palestine problem.
My God.
So I jumped on that and said, General, I can't believe what you just said. Isn't this what the Nazis said about your people? Now you're repeating this? Is this a final solution? And he stumbled around, and then the interview was cut short. And when I went back to the office, the interviewer, his name was Tim Weigel. He was a sports guy who was doing the afternoon show that summer. He said, you won't believe the hateful calls. Our switchboard lit up, and my bureau chief said, you will never be allowed to do another interview with NBC. So I said, well, look, I was just responding to the general. Don't you think final solution is pretty radical statement? And he just defended it, and that was it.
Yeah.
So there's another foretaste
Yeah.
of the genocide to come.
Who could believe it could be on this scale? I mean,
No.
it was in the Guardian, someone from a Department of Health in the Edinburgh University talking about maybe 300,000 will be dead by
Yes.
the end of this year.
I saw
Well,
that 335 is what they're projecting.
yeah.
And it was doctors who were affiliated with the Lancet, which is a highly respected medical journal. Yeah, it's just chilling.
Let's close. I understand your book is going to come out again with a new title next year.
Yes. I'm grateful that the publisher wanted to do a second edition. He wasn't crazy about the title for the first one. He says it's a little too counterintuitive. So I've added 3 new chapters and have made reflections all the way through the text on the impact of Gaza, and this has changed everything. So the new title is No Place Left to Go: Why Palestine Matters. And I'm arguing at the end of it that Palestine is a test case for international law, for the global world order. If they get away with this, if the U.S. and Israel get away with this genocide and it's whitewashed, God forbid, we'll see more massacres. I mean, more genocides. And the next one will be the West Bank, which is unfortunately already underway. So that's why Palestine matters. I think this is a test case for the global world order, and that's how I argue the last chapter.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with me again. I've been speaking to Donald Wagner in the week that we especially remember the earlier massacre in 1982 in Beirut in the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me, Stan.